So we're going to finish this off, and we're going to bring a little perspective of the people. I've invited these leaders from around the state. So we do have a statewide panel here who will explore Oregon's prospects for prosperity and how to share it more widely. With that, I'd like to welcome to the stage. First, I'd like to welcome Vance Beach. Vance is the founder of a program in Medford called BASE. And I actually first got introduced to Vance as he was speaking on stage at the Brit in Jacksonville. And this is one of those situations that you never know who's in the audience. So welcome to Vance.
Thank you.
The second person I'd like to introduce is a woman who I have a tremendous amount of admiration for. I think that she is arguably the best educator, principal that we have in our state. She's been the leader at the Beaverton High School for the last, we'll call it 7 years, probably feels like 15. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Ann Irwin to the stage, please. Third is a gentleman that I've got a chance to get to know. I watched him through his time at Oregon State, watched him as a community member and working with kids, and asked him to be involved in some of the equity work we were doing with TASTE here in Portland, and now I'm more importantly I get to call him friend. And Lamar Hurd is not just a TV analyst for the Portland Trailblazers for how we might know him publicly. But he also has started a new program called the Herd Mentality, which is on Root Sports, and it's really highlighting great community efforts across the Portland metropolitan area and hopefully beyond. Lamar, welcome to the stage. Next, I'd like to welcome the co-president of Bigfoot Beverage, and Bigfoot Beverage is one of the largest beverage distributors actually out of Eugene. They serve all of our Southern Oregon markets, the coast, and have been around for really a couple of generations now. Originally started in Roseburg and Eugene and over into Bend. So welcome Eric Forrest to the stage. And then finally, I like him already because he went to Oregon State and he's at Oregon State, but welcome Dr. Christopher Nichols. He's the director of the Center of Humanities at Oregon State University. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the stage. We're gonna have a conversation here. So this could go a lot of different directions, and hopefully we do it well. So let's just see what happens. All right, guys.
Sounds good.
Dr. Nichols, let's start with you. And we're gonna go. And that's the last time I call him Dr. Nichols. He's now Chris. Let's talk about history. Yeah. And you've done a lot of work on history. You understand kind of where things have been. You have a lot of perspective. I think there's a lot of great things there that people in this audience can learn from. And I can tell you that when the pandemic hit last spring, or a year ago now, the first thing I did was I read The Great Pandemic, which was about the Spanish flu, so I could gain some perspective on what exactly was it that we were working through. So maybe with that lens, tell us what we should know.
Yeah, so thanks for asking about history. Thanks for having me here on this great panel. So when I first started studying the history of the 1918 flu pandemic, no one cared about it. Zero people. I'm telling you, my editors didn't want to publish the pieces of my book on it. Now you can't avoid it, right? And you're just exactly the kind of person that I encounter all the time. Read John Barry's Great Pandemic, read the influenza, all kinds of amazing accounts of the pandemic exist. So one of the things we heard when we first were confronted with COVID is we don't know what to do. And the historians and public health scholars raised their hand and they said, no, we do. We have amazing data on this. We know about non-pharmaceutical interventions, so-called NPIs, right? These are social distancing, closure policies, limits on indoor gathering. When you don't have vaccines, you know what to do. These are age-old techniques. They go back to antiquity about how to deal with plagues and that sort of thing, right? Literally a quarantine means keeping a ship out of port for 40 days. It goes way back. So we know what works. We actually, from the 1918 flu pandemic, have great city and state data. And one of the takeaways when I was first writing op-eds about that moment, as we were confronted with it in March 2020, was that all the action in the US in 1918 and in many other places around the world was local. It was mayors, it was public health officials, it was governors who were really running the show. One amazing data point, if you haven't heard this, is that Woodrow Wilson in 1918 and 1919 never once publicly mentioned the flu pandemic. World War I was far more important for the US and the world, and part of that was actually taking the eye off the ball of what really matters in a pandemic, which is the ethics of keeping people alive, right? And we were confronted with that in 2020. This question that everybody here was confronted with, the health of the economy versus the public health of the individuals in society. And that's a false binary. One of the things that I've emphasized in my work is you can have some of both. And there are really good studies by the Fed in St. Louis and elsewhere that in fact, local and state economies rebounded faster in 1918 and 1919 when they put on strong public health measures that were well practiced and observed. Those behaviors work. And you've seen that in a lot of the states, actually, that did well, and our state is one of them. A stronger rebound, a capacity to deal with the deaths and suffering of those infections. And I guess the broader historical perspective, just to start us off, is we're now living in the second worst deadly viral pandemic in world history. If you want to think about it in a US historical context, more Americans have died in this epic excess death event than in all foreign wars combined. More have died than in the Civil War, the most costly in US history. And yet our society has not confronted just how bad those costs are and also how unequally borne they have been on people of color, on lower socioeconomic status folks. And that was very similar to 1918. I think that's something that we'll be talking about more.
Interesting, interesting. Great, thank you for sharing. That's, yeah, so many lessons to be learned if we just started asking the right questions, right? So as you think about learning, and I think all of us, as I mentioned at the opening today, have learned something about ourselves or about what's happened around us. And maybe I'll throw it out to the panel, and maybe you can kick us off here. But as an educator, or just in general from your perspective, like, what have you learned during this crazy couple of years? Like, how do you capture that?
Well, as we entered into March of 2020, at Beaverton High School, we committed ourselves to, when we emerged, that we would be smarter, we'd be kinder, and we would be stronger as a school, as a community. And so we've taken the opportunity to learn through all the challenges that we've faced. We, like many high schools or many schools, are blessed with a very, very strong, supportive community. So we had that before the pandemic, we had it during, and we have it after. And how do we draw on those assets that are our collective assets as a staff, as a student body, as parents, as our community? And that's going to serve us. It served us well before the pandemic, during, and it's continuing to serve us now. We also use the opportunity to think about teaching and learning and how that is evolving. I went to Churchill High School before I went to the University of Oregon, and in many ways, the school that I'm a principal of is very similar to what I experienced as a Churchill Lancer in the 70s. And of course, many parts are very, very different. And so we're trying to learn every day, how do we meet the challenges of an evolving future that's very different than what I was preparing for. And I taught for a very long time, and even then what I was preparing students for. I think the last piece that's been in the forefront of our eyes, especially since we came back this year, is the remote experience. It may be counterintuitive, allowed us, forced us, enabled us to learn a lot more about the lives of our students and what the challenges that they were facing. And then once you know that, once you see that, our obligation as educators, which we've been trying to meet the needs that we saw before, is imperative that we move through and on to what's ahead of us in a way that's informed by that understanding.
Yeah, and I think that, so Lamar, as you have a different lens on that, just given the travels that you've been through, and you've seen it from an entertainment standpoint. an entertainment industry that had to completely adjust to if they were going to stay afloat and survive, how they were going to do that. And maybe, what did you see, maybe lessons learned from the last year and a half as far as being on the road, and how have you seen that happen?
Well, thank you for having me go after two high-level educators. So, of course, my answer
Well, Vance and Eric,
is not going to be at quite that level. But for me, whenever things like this happen, my mind a lot of times goes to youth right away, because I've been working with kids now for about 13 years. That's how I got to the Portland area. I know I'm currently the Trailblazers analyst, but I, in my mind, gave up being on TV to work with kids and started coaching them back in 2007. That's how I became a Portland resident after playing a season of basketball overseas in Germany. The reason I did it was because, Jonathan, as you know, my personal story, I'll cut it short here, but I had a coach that raised me through the game of basketball. I grew up in Houston, Texas, in a home with just my mom and my two brothers. Basketball was my life, and it was my biggest influence. It was my biggest pull. If somebody told me to go this way and it will help me with basketball, I would go. If they say go this way and it'll help me, then I'll go. So I was fortunate to have somebody in my life that steered me the right direction with that. So once I became an adult, my thoughts kind of always circle back to how is this kind of thing impacting kids. And one thing I saw from adults in my entertainment business that I want to be able to get ahead of with kids is being able to identify who you are versus what you do. Because what I saw right away as soon as the pandemic hit and we get the call from the NBA saying the season is shutting down, and so all of a sudden now you're no longer an announcer because there aren't any games. Now who are you? And that was a struggle for a lot of people in my profession because there was really never that examination of who am I deeper than what it is I do, than my profession. If I lose this, what happens? And a lot of times athletes, they are given an opportunity to face that on, or people, even in our profession, whether it's, hey, Eric, you might have an ACL one day. Your ACL might tear on you. What are you going to do next? Those conversations confront you at certain times, but it's hard to kind of sit down and attack and look right in the eyes. What I would love to do is, as I was thinking throughout the past couple years, is I think it's just imperative, as I saw what a lot of adults struggle with, again, particularly in my field, but I would believe it kind of happened in all types of industries, is to be able to get ahead of things with kids and help them really identify who it is you want to be. Not necessarily what you want to be. I know the question is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And a lot of them maybe don't know that kind of thing, but I think if we can help them start thinking about who do you want to be, what are your core values, what are your principles, what do you care about, how do you want to help people, so that once they do identify, okay, I am passionate about this sport or this profession or this thing. Now, how do I use that thing to attach to my core principles, and then how do I then spin that forward to help people and create long-lasting change? And last thing I'll say for this is, I think a lot of that is up to the leaders and decision makers to set a certain example for kids of what is cool. So I know for me, growing up as a kid, if I watched TV and I saw somebody on TV, I thought that's cool. I don't even know what you're talking about half the time, but you're on TV and I want to do that. If it's an NBA player, or if it's somebody that seems like they are being applauded for whatever their work is, I thought I kind of want to do that. And I think we got a chance over this last year through social justice movements, through just recognition of kind of what's going on at a deeper level, to see what the need is out there. Like, what's really, really important. One phrase I heard a lot this past year is, I'm not going to take that for granted anymore. And so my question would be, what else do we need to happen, or what else do you need to know to understand, like, yeah, we're done taking stuff for granted. We're done waiting for something to get to like in sports, we hear a sense of urgency all the time. I got a Trailblazer game tonight. At some point, most likely, because the team's been getting off to slow starts in the first half, it's been a problem. But a sense of urgency picks up in the second half because you can see that finish line. And, you know, guys are playing harder. They're diving a little more. That's a basketball game. Like, the sense of urgency for real life got to be there right now. And we can't wait till the end, because we're talking about the end of lives, not the end of a game. And some people can't come back from that stuff. So over the last couple of years, yeah, it's just, that's really been kind of on my heart and my mind of just really upping the ante. You know, like, if we don't realize the time is now, then I don't know what is going to get that across to us.
For sure, for sure. Well said. Well said. And Vance, as you've been building something in Southern Oregon here over the last few years and seeing a vision, but you're also doing it through a very challenging time for families, for kids, for professionals. How has that helped inform where you build from? And maybe when you went into this, a few years ago, now that you're coming out of where you're at today, how does this inform where you want to take things in the Southern Oregon area?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that, first of all, thank you for having me here, because this is a great opportunity for me. As a community organizer and a community builder, I think you really, really begin to understand how important community really is, right? You begin to understand how important human value is and social connections, right? And I think one of the biggest things for me was, really, really understanding we cannot lose those connections no matter what's going on. So we really got to get creative. We got to figure out how to continue to have these connections. People ask us all the time, how we made such an impact in such a short time with our community, and it's really simple. We stepped up, got very active, and did it in creative, safe ways. Whether it was social connections that were being severed, right? We figured out a way to do networking events via Zoom with breakout sessions, bingo nights, and game nights. We just stepped up, figured out a creative way. Racial issues were on an all-time high. We can't walk away from people. We need to be there, right? For the last 30 plus years in our region, I think organizations and businesses, individuals had always come together to do a live MLK event, right? And this is a time period where nobody was going to do anything. And for me, that was like, no. This is when we need that philosophy. We need that message the most. We figured it out. We stepped up. We did a feature film on Martin Luther King's 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait. And we paralleled those visuals with what exactly was happening right now. We really stepped up, did a challenge, did a call to action. We even did ongoing facilitated conversations throughout the year. So we really just continued to keep those connections alive. The people needed information. We had to be there. Police brutality. Protests were happening everywhere, all throughout our state. We stepped up. We got engaged with our local law enforcement leaders, right? Had meaningful conversations around how we can create better and safer communities, how we can engage the community to bridge this gap of community and institution, right? And we just stepped up. We got there. We had conversations. After a year and a half of doing forums, bringing people together, we now have a liaison program that might be a national model, the first of its kind. We just stepped up. That's what we did, and we did it in creative, safe ways. And I think that's what we need to take from this. We can't lose connections. We can't lose each other. And the best way to do that is, get behind each other. I think our businesses, our organizations, we all need to have some form of synergy amongst each other if we're all looking to advance community. And we got to figure out how to do it in creative, safe ways.
Fantastic, fantastic. Great job. And Eric, as a leading a business that does work with communities all over our state, lots of small businesses, but then also you do work with the Ford Family Foundation out of Roseburg as well. How have kind of the lessons out of the pandemic how have you seen some of that affect business? Are you seeing business come back? Are your customers back? Did you lose a lot of customers? Like how have you guys kind of seen that and what your perspective is on that?
It's, for our business, we operate both and not necessarily metro, but when you think about Eugene and Bend and then rural. And there's been disparate impacts through this. I think sat through some of the presentations this morning, and I just want to highlight quickly, there is an inequity in Oregon right now with rural. And when you look at the demographics of rural and the results we're getting, and sorry, I'm kind of hijacking your question.
That's okay. That's okay.
So when you look at the demographics in Oregon right now, if you look at urban, the biggest bubble in ages right now is 25 to 39. If you look at rural, the bubble is 55 to 69. So a 30-year gap in terms of the aging demographics of what's going on. Inward migration in urban, 2 times as big as what's going on in rural. If you look at labor force participation, there's a 10-point gap. You're in the low 60s in urban, you're in the low 50s in rural. You're seeing 3 times the jobs growth right now in urban as you are in rural. And then when you look at the cohort group of 4-year college graduates, there's 50% more college graduates in urban as there is in rural right now in Oregon. And when you think about what's near and dear to my heart with kids, and I think that's the other thing that we've got to look at, if we're looking at prosperity in the future, it's got to start earlier. We talked a lot today about education later on in life, but when you think about pre-K, early childhood education, child care, we've got a foster care system in the state of Oregon right now where there's twice as many kids in foster care on a per capita basis in rural as there is in urban. If you look at the 188 school districts in the state of Oregon, the top 27 for per capita on homelessness, all rural. And if you look at child care slots, all of Oregon is an urban child care desert, so not good anywhere, but there's 50% more slots in urban versus rural in Oregon. And then just finally, as we were talking about earlier today, about kids going on and pursuing secondary education, in the state of Oregon right now, if you are an urban female, about 63% are pursuing secondary education. If you're a rural male, it's 35%. Of that 35%, 58% are going to community college. And of that 58, only 26% are coming out with a certificate of completion or an associate's degree. So there's a big difference in what's going on right now in urban and in rural. And so we see that economically too. I mean, there has been more suffering on the rural side. We've had some, the urban restaurant business has actually held pretty steady with the apps that are available now, with greater availability of workforce. But we're seeing in the outerlying areas a bigger hit. And so it's a tougher environment out there right now as you think about going through the pandemic and ability to have any kind of safety net or any kind of buffer within your economy. Rural is just behind, and we need to support that if we're going to have a prosperous state.
Do you have a feel, I didn't prep you for this question, but do you have a feel for how your business stands at the end of 2021 versus the end of 2019?
Very different. Our business, if you looked at bottom line results in terms of, let's call it volume, we'll do more business in 2021 than we did in 2019.
That's great.
But we'll do it very differently. There's 12% less restaurants in our book of business right now.
Yep.
So that's a lot of local jobs that left. Now that has morphed over to bigger box retailers, grocery store, and then you also see it through the e-commerce channel. And of course, Amazon.com, Prime Pantry was a way for people to have contactless purchasing. And so you saw a morphing of where folks found their beverages.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Chris, I didn't prep you for this one, but it's coming to my head. So as you look at recoveries from pandemics, and you look at, maybe do you have some perspective, like you talked about the Spanish flu earlier and the death toll, but when did things recover? How should we expect to see a timeline? Is it going to happen next year? Are we talking another decade?
Right.
Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think history provides some useful insights, but also cautions that we can't know. I mean, we know that there will be more variants. We were talking about this a little bit backstage. We know an open question, a question that historians of public health get a lot is, how do pandemics end? Which is another version of what you're saying. And the reality is they don't end. They become endemic almost always. We've virtually never eliminated viruses, right? Smallpox, polio are the best cases where vaccines plus proactive world public health have pushed those to next to none. But the 1918 pandemic, the H1N1, is the backbone of the seasonal flu that's with us every day, every year, right, that we prepare for. That's really what we need to think about in this moment, if we can get through enough vaccinations and other things to not have catastrophically high death and infection rates. So, but if you're thinking, the business plan, thinking to 2030, I think that's a nice time horizon. So if you're thinking to 1918, you're thinking to the US. Most people quickly, if you have your survey US history, you think roaring 20s, right? And the historians say, no, hold on. 20s were not what you think it was. There's a readjustment of the economy right after the war, right after the pandemic. So the major deaths in the 1918 pandemic are not like this one. The major non-pharmaceutical interventions are not like this one. They only held on those strictures for 6 months to 6 weeks in 1918 into 1919. Tons of people, the virus burned through people then in a way that it hasn't now. And so then by the spring of 1919, you're starting to see a real dip. You don't have to have proactive measures put in, but the business community and local leaders took seriously the possibility that the next flu would require throwing on those measures. So one lesson there is, hey, be prepared to rapidly close and to phase your reopening following data and disease. That's one thing. Second one is a lot of insular politics come out of pandemics. So if you think about the 1920s, you should also think about race massacres, the rise of the Klan, dramatic immigration restriction in the US context. So as that economy actually got built around speculation and that sort of thing, it was the US looking inward, actually, and those sort of myopic views were what led to the sort of tariff policies and other things that exacerbated the coming of the Depression. So if you're thinking about how do you slot in local to state to national business and world leadership, I would say you need to be thinking globally and cooperatively. That's one lesson out of that moment. So for me as a historian who also studies the world, we need to think about a global public health strategy. Even as this pandemic hopefully recedes, doesn't fully end, how can we be part of stopping the next one so we don't have 700,000, 800,000, we'll clock over 1 million catastrophic American deaths falling largely on marginalized people in the US. So that's a piece of that puzzle. I think we can't, say there's a great boom and we'll all be really happy with a boom in a couple years. Don't take our eyes off the ball of preparedness for the next. And what we're hearing on this panel and what we've been hearing today is about what perspectives, as Lamar was putting it, right? What kind of new awarenesses do we have that we can apply to have more proactive public health measures, but public policy to encourage higher education, as we're talking about, rural questions, all that sort of stuff. So coming out of 1918, the US doesn't develop a federal public health infrastructure, leaving the US not prepared for our next pandemic. And I could go on, but other countries learned that lesson. Canada did. And Canada, if you fast forward 100 years, if we had applied the same public health measures in the US as Canada did, which is not a country thought of as having done a very good job, 350 to 400,000 Americans would be alive today. That's what we need to do. We need to at least be able to have an adequate response next time and focus on the kinds of questions that really matter. I would suspect that the 1918 moment into the 20s is a good one for us to think about. How can we not fall into the traps of xenophobia, of blaming ourselves, of racial injustice, of all those sorts of problems, but rather have a much more open conversation about the problems in our society, confront the difficult past, and what this moment has, the fractures and fissures in society we have seen today, it strikes me, are things we absolutely need to address, or we're in really deep trouble.
Well, gee, thanks for that. That makes me feel
You asked, we didn't prepare for that one.
But I guess if the warning signal hasn't been heard, you just heard the warning signal, so let's get to work. Thank you for that. So I think to the rest of the panel, and you all come from various degrees of community and education and workforce. Where are we headed from your perspective? And maybe, from the things that you're doing today to kind of where things are going, like the warning shot's been thrown over the bow by Chris, but where are things going and what's kind of your worry about that? And Ann, maybe I'll throw that to you first.
Mine's not a worry. I'm really optimistic for education in the state of Oregon. That's because what I know, right? But I'm optimistic about education, period. Look, I taught for 21 years. Teaching in February of 2020 was hard. It was hard. And there were many things that were going on in the lives of our students that we knew about, and there were many that there weren't. One of the hardest parts of the pandemic and being remote that I heard as I sat and chatted with colleagues and teachers is going through March of 2020 until we came back into hybrid with the movement for social justice and all of the emotions and the trauma and the excitement that brought, and that our teachers didn't get to sit with their students and talk that through, and that they were in little boxes, many of which didn't have cameras on. And it tugged at what is central to the core of every educator, to be there, to walk alongside students and be there for them when things are great and when things are difficult. And so not to be able to do that was very, very difficult. Now coming back, after being apart for so long, we had a wonderful start to our school year. I'll speak only for our school and maybe our district, but we're having some difficulties now as we get back into what it means, Vance, you mentioned it, to be together, like to reform those connections when we've been apart for so long. But I have great optimism for education as we come out of this. We've learned a tremendous amount. At Beaverton High School, we're committed to, at the end of graduation, that everyone is either enrolled, employed, or enlisted. Everyone has a plan. Leaving high school, leaving the K-12 system without a plan is no longer an option. And if you don't have that, you know, what Lamar talked about, if you can't see that ahead of you, we'll help you find it. Because that's our obligation. You can't shake my hand on the stage, hand you a diploma cover, pick up your diploma, and then be on your way. Our obligation carries with you into your future, and it's our responsibility to get you prepared for that, confident about it, and excited about it every single day. And that's, I would say that is a very different reality for students who attend schools now than when I attended high school. I think there is a much stronger connection. We ask students all the time, who's a trusted educator for you today? And I am hard-pressed to find many students who can't answer that question. And I think that's true of all the schools in Oregon. And so I'm very optimistic about what we've learned, and now we got to put to work what we've learned.
And Vance, you talked about community and connection and bringing people together. Like, as you kind of where you're headed with that work, and as you see those things, how are things going to be different? Like, what are you hopeful for, or what do you think is maybe some of the things we need to do?
Right. I think it's crucial to keep racism at the forefront. We ran into so many issues that have been highlighted now, where I feel we've got to a point where we've gotten a bit numb to them. And so I think that needs to stay there. And the good news is about the virus, as much bad as it did, we know that when we see a crisis or a threat to our civilization, we can focus on it and we can deal with it. And I think that same urgency and that same commitment needs to be done with some of these disparities, inequities, racial issues. We've proven we can do it, and I think we need to focus on that. I think also we need to make sure that we are understanding that a lot of the issues that are here are generational issues. And so community is super important. I think the equity that we put in must be constructive, right? I think the equity must ensure that it's creating sustainable pathways of progression to where nobody is limited, but everybody can be equal contributors to the advancement of society. I think that's a must. That's where we should go. When we do this work, we look at this really in 4 phases in terms of our community building. And really it's this first phase of kind of an empowerment culture phase where you gotta make connections. You gotta have reliability. You have to have trust. You have to have relationships. Essential, you have to meet people where they are, or else you can forget about it. And then in terms of the empowerment in particular, you have to provide the support and resources that don't just spark interest, but that give people the confidence to achieve goals, right? And then from that point, we can move to a more community-based group vision, and then you can go chugging along to aggregation. You got your resources, your support, you know who's who, what businesses belong to what talent you got, and now you can apply that to that group vision, and you're kind of creating somewhat of a process now that's somewhat sustainable in how you're being equitable. And then we get to that, what Dr. Claude Anderson calls vertical integration, right? Which is much different than just integration. We've been integrated, quite frankly, since the time of slavery, socially integrated. But we need to get to that point of integration where, again, everyone is an equal contributor to the advancement of our society. And I kind of always like to use Booker T. Washington's famous phrase, but I like to put it into our context. We can be as unique as the 5 fingers on our hand, right? But we're all still a part of that hand. If you look at our base logo, it's actually a multicolored fist. And what we're indicating there is what it means when we can come together, right? What it means when we can come together. That is a force that goes above and beyond advancing community in ways we can't even imagine. And that's where we need to get to. We need to get to not limiting nobody. We need to really be pushing society far, far apart, far, far along. And I know we can do it. We've shown pockets of it throughout history, little spurts of it. We just got to maintain it. And I think some of these sustainable equity formats can help us, because we should not be seeing today a 1963. You know, we got to be moving forward. And so it's essential. And I think we just need to stop saying it, but start seeing it. I think we need to stop saying change and be the change. You know, I think it's crucial. It's very, very important. And I'll just leave you all with, as we go into this new way and shaping our new world, James Baldwin said it best when he said, we made the world we live in, and we can make it over again.
Love that. Okay, we're a little over time, but again, last 2 slots here, I want to give you guys a spot.
I could be really
You
quick.
wanna go
I just
first?
wanted to kind of, just based on what they said. What we need is for people's emotion to become conviction. There was a lot of emotion over the last couple years. People seeing things, and I hear you talking, Ann, about how you're hopeful for education, and at Beaverton High School, because you're in charge, and you're going to control what you can control. So like that's another sports term we hear all the time. You know, just handle what you can handle. Can't handle all the makes and misses, but you can control your energy, effort, what kind of teammate you are. And so that's a great thing for those kids at Beaverton High School. Vance, what I hear from you is we need community partners. We need people teaming up, which I agree with. However, you can't control all that. And so you need people who have been moved emotionally by some of the things they're learning, they're hearing, to become convicted on that, so that it becomes that commitment, so that sense of urgency is where yours is right now, because we can hear it as you're talking. Like you understand the need right now. And so that's what we need. That's what I would challenge all change agents to do, is become convicted. If you're not already, become convicted in what's going on and how you can help. You know, like, we don't need to do this all the time in order to get it. We don't have to wait till doing this next year to get it. You know, so if you know the people that can help the stuff he's talking about, that everybody's been talking about, but there's segments of the population that when you ask them the job, so how do you feel moving forward? How's the hope? They'll tell you, I don't really feel hopeful. I don't know, because I need help. I need some more help to get out of this. So if I don't get it, I don't know. Whereas other people might be in a position where it's like, oh, I can control my own destiny. I can put my own individual self in a certain place where I'm cool, but I don't know if everybody else is going to be. So that would just be
awesome.
What I would hope for people, yeah.
Thank you. Eric, bring us home.
Wow. No, I'll be brief, and I'll bring it back to business, but I'll tie it into the state too. I think going forward, how do we get to the next step? I think for all of us, the old phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast, the Drucker phrase, as we are trying to operate businesses going forward, we are going into I think we're going to have the tightest labor market we could have ever imagined for the next few years. And if we all don't have our culture right, so that the Gen Zers can see what you're doing, and whether that's your DEI work, whether that's walking your talk, whether that's making sure that it used to be about overtime, now people want work-life balance, all the culture stuff you talk about, you better have, because it'll sniff you out. So I would encourage, culture is going to be key going forward for each and every one of us. And I would say the same thing is true for the state. I firmly believe what's best for kids is always words to live by. And as we we sat through the presentations today, I think if we as a state can think about what's best for kids, if we catch kids early enough and we care for our kids, and as a society and a culture, we can demonstrate that we put kids first, a lot of the stuff we talked about today will fall right in line with our strategy. But if we don't have the culture of what's best for kids, we're going to continue to have problems.
Yeah.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the panel. Appreciate it. Great job. Thank you. Thank you.